What happens when the First Lady takes a subtle jab on national TV, only for a Congresswoman to clap back with a $100 million lawsuit? No shouting, no hashtags, just one look. And the courtroom lights came on. It all started in Dallas, Texas, at what was supposed to be a quiet civil education panel hosted by the White House. A few microphones, a few policy notes, and a room full of educators. Nothing controversial. Until Melania Trump took the mic. She stood there, polished as ever, cool demeanor, white gloves of elegance. But her words, anything but clean. "With all due respect," she said, "it's always interesting to hear from those who claim to care about public schools, while billing taxpayers for designer shoes and boutique hotels. No name, no direct accusation, but every camera cut to one face. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't frown. She folded her hands and stared forward like she'd just heard a dog whistle at full volume. It took less than 30 seconds for the clip to hit social media. Within 5 minutes, it had subtitles. Within an hour, it was fire. She just accused a sitting congresswoman of theft. This is slander, right? She didn't say the name, but we all know the target. The panel ended, but the explosion had just begun. Backstage, Jasmine's team looked like they'd just witnessed a hit and run. Her communications director, Brianna, was already scrolling. "It's viral," she said, "and it's ugly." "She wants us to flinch," Jasmine said calmly. "Let's make her regret it." But the damage was spreading like wildfire. The next morning, news outlets ran Melania's words over slow-motion clips. Headlines screamed, "Boutique hotel scandal," "Jasmine Crockett accused," "Taxpayer funds under fire." The problem? There was no scandal, no misuse, just a lie dressed up in pearls and passive aggression. Jasmine had built her career on policy, not profile. She had never once been cited for ethics violations, not a single inquiry. Her expense records were cleaner than most senators' lunch orders. But now, the court of public opinion wasn't asking for receipts. They were demanding guilt. Commenters claimed she'd spent thousands on private jets. Others accused her of luxury dinners during budget crises. None of it was true, but truth didn't trend. Emails poured in. Hate mail surged. Some called for her resignation. Others threatened violence. Her mother called crying. Her cousin in Tulsa had been asked if the rumors were true. "I told them you're not like that," she whispered. Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't have to, because she knew something the First Lady didn't. This wasn't just political theater. This was war. And Jasmine was done playing polite. 2 days later, Jasmine Crockett met in private with her legal team. She didn't pace. She didn't rant. She laid a single folder on the table and said, "I want a file." Her lead counsel, Raymond, looked her dead in the eye. "You're suing the First Lady of the United States for defamation?" Jasmine nodded once. "She weaponized her platform. Now I'm using mine." They filed in federal court, 48 pages, bulletproof, exhibits, screenshots, timestamps, and one number stamped across the top in bold, $100 million. The media called it a political stunt. The White House called it baseless. The internet, it called it justice. Because people were tired of seeing black women gaslit, minimized, lied about, and told to stay calm. And Jasmine? She was tired of swallowing her pride so someone else could keep their narrative clean. In the days that followed, the media turned into a war zone. Melania's team released a carefully crafted statement. The First Lady was speaking generally. Any offense taken is unfortunate but unintended. Polished, polite, and absolutely useless. Because the public wasn't buying it. Not after Jasmine's team dropped the first bombshell. A leaked internal email, sent 3 days before the panel, from a White House staffer warning Melania's advisors not to touch Jasmine. Her ethics file is spotless. She's well respected. Any implication of financial misconduct could backfire. The reply from Melania's camp? She'll take it. The base will love it. That wasn't just negligence, that was intent. And when Jasmine's legal team verified the metadata on that email, the lawsuit changed from a shot in the dark to a laser-guided missile. Then came the transcript, leaked from inside the Eisenhower executive office. A strategy meeting. Melania's senior advisor saying, "If we phrase it right, she'll look guilty without us saying it." And Melania? "People won't fact-check feelings." That line broke the internet. People won't fact-check feelings. It was smug, it was cruel, and it was caught on paper. The hashtag #FactCheckFeelings trended for 72 hours. Even late-night TV got involved. One host cracked Melania's strategy, lie politely. And Jasmine? She didn't tweet. She didn't post. She prepared. Because this wasn't about clapping back. It was about calling it out in court. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse was surrounded. One side held signs that read, "Accountability now." The other? "Let Melania speak." But inside, it wasn't about signs. It was about facts. Raymond opened with a line that sliced the air. "This case is not about politics. It's about power. And what happens when someone powerful decides to smear a public servant with deliberate falsehoods on national television for applause?" Melania's lawyers fired back. She never said Jasmine's name. She wasn't pointing fingers. People heard what they wanted. But the jury didn't buy it. Not when Jasmine's team laid out the emails, not when they played the transcript, and especially not when Jasmine herself took the stand. She sat there, hands folded, and looked every juror in the eye. "This wasn't about hurt feelings," she said. "It was about how quickly a lie becomes a headline, how fast a reputation can be burned down by a whisper in a velvet voice. I didn't ask to be lied about, but I will not be silent about it." There was no shouting, no dramatics, just a woman refusing to let her name be buried under someone else's narrative. It took the jury less than 12 hours. They found in her favor. The damages, $83 million. But Jasmine didn't smile. She just exhaled, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about repair. In her words, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. The verdict sent a tremor across the country. News anchors tried to catch up with the moment. An unprecedented ruling in modern political history. A sitting First Lady found liable for defamation. This changes everything. But the biggest shift wasn't on CNN. It wasn't in headlines. It was in living rooms, in classrooms, in phone calls between mothers and daughters. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just rare. It was revolutionary. She hadn't cried on camera. She hadn't stormed out of interviews. She had stood still, demanded the truth, and held someone powerful accountable. And that's what people remembered. In a public middle school in Milwaukee, a teacher paused her civics lesson to stream Jasmine's courtroom remarks. Students sat in silence. In Oakland, a women's shelter hosted a community talk called "Your Voice Has Value: Lessons from Jasmine Crockett." Even in places Jasmine had never visited, her story became something more than political. It became personal. One woman posted on TikTok, "I was lied about at work, almost lost my job, and no one believed me until I fought back." Jasmine reminded me, truth doesn't apologize. But as Jasmine quietly returned to Congress, she did so knowing the war wasn't over. Melania's team immediately filed an appeal. They called the damages excessive. They claimed the trial had been biased. They leaned heavily on the phrase, "This sets a dangerous precedent." But what they really meant was, this sets a new standard. The public had seen through the polish, through the passive-aggressive statements, through the idea that power should never be challenged, and they liked what they saw on the other side. Jasmine didn't give more speeches. She didn't ride the media wave. She went back to work. Late one night, after a housing committee hearing, she sat alone in her office reading letters, one from a teenage girl in Tulsa. "I'm running for student council this year. I used to be scared of speaking up. Not anymore." Another from a retired judge in Georgia. "Thank you for proving that words have weight, even in silence." But Jasmine's favorite message came from a woman in Louisiana. No big words, no signature, just, "You didn't just win a case. You reminded us our names matter." She held that letter a little longer, folded it, tucked it into her journal, and whispered the same thing she'd said on the courthouse steps. We are not powerless, not anymore. Months later, the appeal wound its way through the system. Jasmine didn't rush it. She didn't need to. Because even if the damages were reduced, even if some parts of the judgment shifted, the win was already sealed, not just in court, but in culture. The phrase Crockett standard had entered Capitol Hill vocabulary. Staffers used it when vetting press briefings. Double-check that. We don't want to get Crocketed. A nonprofit in Boston launched an annual award for women in leadership. They called it the Crockett Honor. Journalists began referring to defamation against public officials with a new seriousness, because one case had shown what truth, precision, and persistence could really do. Meanwhile, Melania Trump stayed mostly silent. Her legal team worked quietly in the background. Her social media went dark. She was seen at 2 events in the next 3 months, both brief, both guarded. In the conservative ecosystem, talking heads began changing their tune, not because they'd grown more ethical, but because Jasmine had made recklessness expensive. "You better be ready to back it up," one podcast host said. "That Crockett case cost them $83 million. You want to be the next headline?" And just like that, a woman they tried to label as angry, petty, overreacting became the new cautionary tale for liars in power. But Jasmine didn't care about the labels anymore. She'd learned something. The people who shout the loudest about dignity often mean, "Stay quiet while I disrespect you." And she refused. Not now, not ever again. Late one autumn afternoon, she visited her alma mater, the small state college in East Texas where her journey had started. She stood in a lecture hall packed with law students. No cameras and no press, just future attorneys scribbling notes. One student asked, "How do you decide when to let something go and when to fight?" Jasmine smiled. "When it's about ego, let it go. When it's about your name, fight like the whole truth depends on it. Because sometimes it does." The room was silent. Then the clapping started. Software steady. Certain, and that was Jasmine Crockett's legacy. Not just a congresswoman, not just a headline, but a reminder that words can wound, that silence isn't always strength, that reputation isn't disposable, and that when someone powerful tries to write your story for you, you pick up the pen and say, "Not today." The buzz didn't fade after the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, the verdict had barely sunk in when the aftershocks began. Inside the White House, silence hung heavier than chandeliers. Behind closed doors, Melania's inner circle gathered around a long walnut table, tension simmering beneath polite expressions. Her chief of staff, Annetta Kohler, slid a stack of printed headlines across the table. First Lady loses defamation suit to Congresswoman Crockett. The $83 million verdict heard around the country. Power versus truth, and truth won. Melania skimmed them one by one. She didn't flinch, but she didn't speak either. "Media's not letting this go," Annetta said carefully. "It's not just politics anymore. This is personal to people now." Another advisor chimed in. "We could file another appeal, but we risk prolonging public scrutiny." Melania tapped one manicured nail on the glass. "She humiliated me," she said quietly. "She made me look small." Annetta didn't answer. Everyone knew Melania's brand wasn't just wealth or beauty, it was poise, and this lawsuit cracked that mask. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett returned to her life, but it wasn't the same life. Back in Dallas, a crowd greeted her outside her district office. They weren't protesting. They were cheering, applauding, crying. One woman pushed forward with her daughter clinging to her hand. "She watched the whole thing," the mother said. 12 years old, wants to go into law now, because you made her believe a black woman could win." Jasmine hugged them both, eyes misting, heart full, but heavy. At home, she walked barefoot across her quiet apartment, past the TV flickering with endless commentary about her case. She didn't stop to watch. She'd lived it. She sat at her kitchen table and opened a worn leather notebook, the one she used before she got elected. The one filled with scribbled ideas and firebrand notes. She added a single sentence, "I didn't just protect my name, I defended the standard." Then came the political tremors. Congressional hearings were now being proposed, real oversight into First Lady expenditures. What had once been considered ceremonial was suddenly under real scrutiny. Late-night comedians joked that Jasmine Crockett had accomplished more transparency in 4 months than some watchdogs had in 4 years. Republican leaders scrambled to regain narrative control. Op-eds ran in conservative outlets questioning whether First Ladies should have public budgets at all. Others subtly distanced themselves from Melania. "She broke the unspoken rule," one senator said privately. "First Ladies don't swing at members of Congress, and if they do, they better not miss." And Melania had missed, badly. Back in the Capitol, Jasmine noticed the change. Fewer sneers in committee rooms, more nods in hallways. Young interns now looked at her not just as a politician, but as a symbol. It wasn't ego, it was weight, and she felt every ounce of it. One night, after a long meeting, Ava found her in her office, staring at a faded photo of Shirley Chisholm on the wall. "You did it," Ava said softly. "No," Jasmine replied. "We shifted something. Doing it, that takes more." Then came the invitations. TED Talks, university commencements, a national speaking tour. Publishers started calling too, wanting to put her story on shelves. But Jasmine wasn't rushing to sign anything. "This isn't a brand," she told Ava. "It's a breach I had to repair. Now I want to build something." And she did. 6 months after the verdict, Jasmine launched the Public Integrity Initiative, a nonprofit watchdog group aimed at training local leaders in defamation law, digital reputation defense, and transparency advocacy. The tagline was simple: "We don't whisper the truth, we defend it." Across the country, city council members, student activists, and small-town mayors joined the training. In their eyes, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was proof that the system could still work if you didn't flinch. But the work wasn't glamorous. Sometimes it was sitting in back rooms of school auditoriums. Sometimes it was Zoom calls with whistleblowers who didn't know if they could speak out. Sometimes it was just listening. One night, Ava handed her a new proposal, an idea for legislation. "A national protection clause," she said. "Stronger safeguards against malicious smears by public officials. Real teeth." Jasmine read the opening line. "The truth should never be the casualty of a podium." Her hand paused on the paper. She smiled. "You know what?" she said. "Let's give them something else to fight." By the end of that week, Capitol Hill was buzzing with a new phrase: the Crockett Clause. It began as an idea, small, whispered in staffer meetings and progressive newsletters, but it caught fire fast. The bill, officially titled the Public Integrity Protection Act, proposed legal safeguards for elected officials and civil servants against coordinated smear campaigns by those in positions of disproportionate power, whether media giants, billionaires, or yes, First Ladies. It wasn't partisan, it was personal, because everyone in government had felt the sting of spin, of deliberate distortion. And Jasmine had done what most hadn't, stood her ground, and walked away victorious. At the press conference introducing the bill, Jasmine stood alongside 2 Republicans and 1 independent. "This isn't about red or blue," she said. "It's about right and wrong." Melania Trump had yet to respond publicly since the verdict. Her team had gone underground. Her official appeal was filed, yes, but no new interviews, no red carpets, not even a birthday tweet. She had vanished, strategically no doubt, letting her lawyers do the talking. And what they said was this: "We believe the court erred in its judgment and will pursue all legal avenues to overturn the decision." But Jasmine wasn't worried. "Appeal all you want," she told Ava one morning over lukewarm coffee. "The truth already moved." She was right. Community centers across the country began holding what they called Crockett Nights. Small gatherings in local libraries, town halls, and church basements where people would read the transcript of the case out loud, then discuss it like scripture. Not because they idolized Jasmine, but because they understood the weight of her win. It wasn't about the money, one woman in Philadelphia told a local news crew. It was about the fact that someone finally stood up and said, You don't get to lie about me just because you have a bigger microphone. In Minneapolis, a group of high schoolers performed a mock trial of the case in their civics class. In Detroit, a city councilwoman fighting a disinformation campaign cited Jasmine's case as precedent. A shift was happening. One small enough to ignore if you weren't paying attention, but strong enough to feel if you'd ever been the target of a whisper. Then came the op-ed that cemented it. It ran in The Atlantic, written by former Supreme Court clerk Tasha Elridge. It was called Truth on Trial, What the Crockett Case Changed Forever. In it, she wrote, "We've spent decades pretending that public lies were simply the cost of being visible. Jasmine Crockett just made the whole country ask, why?" By the time Congress reconvened, Jasmine had re-entered the chamber not as the woman who sued the First Lady, but as the lawmaker who'd drawn a line in the sand. And something interesting happened. People started correcting themselves when they referenced her. "Oh yeah, that's Crockett, the one who sued Melania," became, "That's Crockett, the one who stood up." Behind closed doors, Melania's team debated the appeal endlessly. "She won the verdict, but she's winning the culture," one aide muttered. "If we keep pushing this, it'll look like we're punishing her for being right." But pride is a hard pill to swallow. In a quiet hotel ballroom in Palm Beach, Melania finally gave a statement to a small group of donors. She stood beneath crystal chandeliers and said with her signature calm, "I regret that my words caused harm. I did not intend that, but I understand now. Intent is not always the shield we hope it is." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest she would ever get. The clip aired on morning shows. Some called it elegant, others calculated. Jasmine said nothing. She was busy. Busy finalizing the first version of the public integrity curriculum, a nationwide high school module aimed at teaching young people the difference between opinion and smear, between critique and defamation. She was busy mentoring a group of freshman congresswomen, teaching them how to keep their balance when the internet tilted against them. She was busy doing the work. But late one night, she found herself alone in her office again, lights off, city lights winking outside her window. She scrolled her phone aimlessly until she saw a clip. A student in North Carolina standing on stage at a debate meet, quoting Jasmine's trial speech word for word. She watched the whole thing, breath held, heart tight, and then she whispered to herself, almost smiling, "They thought they could break me with 12 seconds of shade. I gave them a generation of clarity." 3 months later, the appeal hearing opened in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This time, it wasn't a media circus. It was quiet, deliberate. Because the first trial hadn't just been a legal win. It had been a cultural lightning strike. And everyone knew the appeal wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about power trying to rewrite the ending. Melania's legal team had sharpened their arguments. They leaned on precedent, semantics, constitutional protections. Their brief was 82 pages of polished language saying, in essence, she never said her name. That should have been enough. But what Jasmine's team had now wasn't just exhibits and emails. They had impact. Over 300 amicus briefs were submitted in support of the original verdict. Teachers' unions, ethics watchdogs, women's rights groups, even a libertarian think tank that normally avoided culture wars altogether. Inside the courtroom, Raymond Knox stood before the judges and asked a question no one could quite shake. If the First Lady of the United States can float a damaging lie on live television, smirk, and then disappear behind a wall of lawyers, what message are we sending to every woman in this country who doesn't have a microphone big enough to fight back? The judges asked pointed questions. They pressed both sides. But by the end, something was clear. This wasn't a relitigation. This was a reckoning. Outside, journalists asked Jasmine if she was nervous. "No," she replied, because this time the truth got a head start. It took 5 weeks for the court to issue its ruling. They upheld the verdict unanimously. And just like that, the appeal was denied. The damages were finalized, and Melania Trump, for the first time in public life, became legally responsible for defamation. Her team released a final statement. "We are disappointed by the ruling, but accept the court's decision." They didn't mention Jasmine. They didn't have to. Because by then, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman, or a headline, or even a courtroom victor. She was a blueprint. That fall, universities began teaching her case in media ethics in law classes. The quote, "People won't fact-check feelings," became a cautionary tale in PR training modules. In Brooklyn, a mural went up outside a civic center, Jasmine's face, painted against a stormy sky, her trial quote beneath it. "The truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to stand." By winter, the Public Integrity Protection Act passed the House, then the Senate, then, against all odds, was signed into law. The Crockett Clause became federal statute, no ceremony, no fireworks, just a paragraph in the Federal Register protecting public servants from coordinated defamation masked as political theater. But the impact? You could feel it. One evening, Jasmine returned home after a long day on the Hill. Her porch light flickered softly. On her doorstep sat a small package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman in Montana, a single mom, a nurse. It read, "I watched the trial with my teenage daughter. I told her you didn't just win a case, you taught the rest of us how to fight without losing ourselves. We may not all stand in courtrooms, but now we know how to stand up." Tears welled in Jasmine's eyes, not from exhaustion, not from pain, but from something rarer than either. Peace. She folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer already filled with notes like it, then turned off the porch light and let the quiet settle around her. Spring arrived slowly in D.C. The blossoms came early that year, and with them came a calm Jasmine hadn't felt in months. Not silence, but stillness. The kind that only follows a storm. One morning, she walked into her congressional office to find a small crowd gathered inside. Staffers, interns, 2 fellow representatives, all staring at the TV mounted in the corner. C-SPAN was airing a Senate Ethics Committee hearing. One senator, red-faced, was being grilled about unexplained expenditures tied to a private charity event in the Virgin Islands. A reporter murmured into the mic, "What's being informally referred to as the Crockett Standard, the expectation of full documentation for all discretionary expenses, is now guiding this line of questioning." Jasmine just smiled. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Later that week, she received an invitation, not to a gala, not to a press event, to a small local high school on the east side of Houston. A civics teacher had emailed, "We're studying the difference between law and justice. My students asked if you'd come talk about yours." She went. No security detail, no cameras, just a quiet room with scuffed floors, 28 kids, and one chalkboard. One student, a 14-year-old girl with long braids and steady eyes, asked, "How do you stay calm when people lie about you on TV?" Jasmine paused, then answered gently, "Because the truth isn't shaken just because someone says it louder. If I lose my calm, I give them control. But if I stay focused, I keep my story mine." The girl nodded, scribbling it down. Another student raised his hand. "How do you know when it's worth the fight?" Jasmine leaned forward. "If the lie lives longer than the truth, it changes the future. So every time I ask myself, what story do I want told when I'm not here to tell it anymore?" The room went quiet. No bell rang, no applause, just a shift. Something landed. That night, Jasmine walked through the quiet streets of D.C., coat wrapped tightly, breath visible in the cold. She paused by the Lincoln Memorial, stone, shadowed, watching. She looked up, letting the stillness settle around her. Not with exhaustion, not with regret, but with clarity. She hadn't wanted this fight. She hadn't asked for the firestorm, but she had chosen how to walk through it. Head high, words precise, truth intact. And when history looked back, not at the drama, not at the headlines, but at the consequence, it would find her standing exactly where she began, asking questions, demanding answers, and refusing, flat out refusing, to let lies define her name. If Jasmine Crockett's story resonated with you, If you've ever been misrepresented, if you've ever had to defend your name in rooms that didn't want to hear you, then remember this. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs courage. And sometimes it just needs one woman willing to stand, speak, and not blink when the whole world is watching. Subscribe if you're that kind of person, and share it for everyone still learning how to fight without losing themselves. Because silence may seem safe, but it never tells the truth.